3, 2, 1. Ignition. We're on our way, Houston. Vector grid. Ag start.
The last alleged mission to the moon was Apollo 17, which NASA says took place in December of 1972. Since then, absolutely no country claims to have sent astronauts or even animals more than 400 miles above the surface of the Earth. In recent years, Space Shuttle astronauts completed a trip wherein they attained a maximum altitude of 365 miles. Normally, the Space Shuttle orbits at an altitude of approximately 200 miles from the Earth, the same orbit altitude of the International Space Station. Now, you might be asking, why exactly is this maximum distance from Earth relevant to our discussion? Well, let's put it this way. The Moon is 240,000 miles away from the Earth. The diameter of the Earth is 8,000 miles. This puts the Moon at about 30 Earth diameters away. In relation to the Space Shuttle's orbit on this scale, it has never traveled more than 1/2 of 1 inch away from the Earth's surface.
Six, 5, 3 main engines up and burning, 2, 1, and liftoff.
Just getting into orbit is no small feat, as is illustrated by the fact that in all of recorded history, only 3 countries, the United States, China, and Russia, have been able to put a human just into orbit and never being more than 400 miles from Earth. The explanation for this has always been that, except for these 3 countries, every other country in the world has been too cheap and lazy to venture into just Earth orbit. In reality, the reason has to do with the difficulty in accomplishing this. This most of all drives home the point that NASA's claim of sending men on a 240,000-mile trip in 1969, some 600 times further than they can send men today, is just not plausible. One reason the Space Shuttle has not been sent beyond 400 miles into space has to do with the Earth's magnetism. The core of the Earth is molten iron. As it slowly swirls around, it generates a powerful magnetic field surrounding the Earth. These fields cause the formation of 2 radiation belts around the Earth, called the Van Allen radiation belts. They are made of charged particles and are named after James Van Allen, who was in charge of the Geiger counters installed on the Explorer 1 satellite, which discovered the belts in 1958. These belts are formed by trapped charged particles. The magnetic field traps these particles that originate from the Sun. They then spiral around the lines of the Earth's magnetic field, going back and forth between magnetic poles. As pointed out by Ralph Renee, author of NASA Mooned America, Dr. James Van Allen published an article in the March 1959 issue of Scientific American that described the danger in traveling through these belts. In this article, entitled Radiation Belts Around the Earth, on page 47 of this issue, Van Allen states, "Our measurements show that the maximum radiation level as of 1958 is equivalent to between 10 and 100 roentgens per hour, depending on the still undetermined proportion of protons to electrons. Since a human being exposed for 2 days to even 10 roentgens would have only an even chance of survival, the radiation belts obviously present an obstacle to spaceflight. If anyone ever really does go through these belts, it will become apparent just how lethal they really are to humans." Other than the alleged Apollo trips, all other manned spacecraft have stayed below the belts. These belts do not officially begin until an altitude of 1,000 miles is reached. But when one Space Shuttle crew was brave enough to go nearly 400 miles above the Earth, they started to experience some unusual effects. They reported seeing shooting stars, which were a result of the radiation hitting the retinas of their eyes.
And if I'd have landed 20 feet behind where I landed, we'd have landed right back in that crater.
When interviewed, Alan Bean of Apollo 12 initially stated that he had not gone through the belts and did not observe any effects caused by them.
Any ill effects from the Van Allen radiation belts?
No. Now, I'm not sure we went far enough out to encounter the Van Allen radiation belt. Maybe we did.
When it was pointed out that the flight pattern took him through the belts, he changed his story.
The belts are 1,000 miles to 25,000 miles above the Earth.
Then we went right out through them.
No
Kind of
effects
dark,
on...
and I saw this flash of light, and it looked like it was on the moon, but really it wasn't. It was a flash of light in my eye.
Some scientists argue that the trip through the belts was so brief, that is only a few hours, that the radiation would not have had a negative effect on the astronauts. But the question remains, if these belts are not dangerous, why in the last 30 years has absolutely no country put even a monkey past these belts? The standard excuse is that no one has wanted to spend the money to do so. But to write off every advanced country in the world as too stingy and incompetent in over a third of a century to explore further than 400 miles from Earth really is a bit too much to fathom. It is more likely that we simply do not have the technology to go further at this time. Try to imagine the flight pattern of the Apollo moon missions. NASA says that 3 astronauts took off in a multi-stage rocket, and then 3 days later were in lunar orbit some 60 miles above the moon's surface, going about 4,000 miles per hour, or a little over Mach 6. Then, the spacecraft separated into 2 modules. One astronaut stayed in lunar orbit in the CSM. The other 2 flew down to the surface of the moon in the lunar module.
10 feet. Contact. And stop. Okay, Houston, the Challenger has landed.
The first question that immediately comes to mind is how they were able to design a craft on Earth that would perform so well under quite different conditions on the moon, namely in a vacuum and in 1/6 gravity without killing anyone. The Lunar Landing Research Vehicle used to train the astronauts for a landing had a jet engine, which of course would never have worked out in the vacuum of space. NASA's answer to this is that the simulator provided 5/6 or 83% of the propulsion to simulate the amount of thrust that the rocket engine would need to lift the craft while flying down to the surface of the moon. This would be using 83% of Earth's propulsion requirements to adjust for an environment with only 17% of the Earth's gravity? Explanations such as this certainly drive home the point that no matter how convoluted, they will always have a rationalization for everything. After supposedly landing on the moon during Apollo 17, 2 astronauts allegedly spent 3 days there. During this time, they were either in a small capsule, walking on the surface in their air-conditioned spacesuits, or riding around in the $60 million lunar rover.
The lunar surface temperature in the sun should be around 135 degrees today. In the shade, the temperature would again be about minus 100 to minus 150 degrees Fahrenheit. That would be in the shadow of the lunar module.
If the LEM didn't have climate control, and had air in it, would it be hot or cold without the climate control?
If you just took a lunar module, and well, let's take the climate control and it fails. All right, what happens then? You've got air and setting there, it's 70 degrees. If the lunar module is setting in the sun, which it always is, then slowly but surely that temperature inside is going to go up to 250 degrees Fahrenheit. Now you ain't going to make it, because you're going to cook long before that.
What powered the air conditioning?
What powered the air? Batteries. You had a number of big batteries in the lunar module. They powered pumps, they powered the air conditioning, they powered the communication system, and that's the reason we were only able to stay on the moon 33 hours. Later on, we got a little better batteries, more batteries, and we could stay longer.
Now let's examine some problems with the astronauts' time on the moon's surface. In the sunlit areas, the temperature on the surface of the moon is 250 degrees Fahrenheit. If the sunlight struck the astronauts' suits or the surface of the moon, they would heat up very quickly. Considering that they always landed on the daylight side of the moon, the energy from the sun would be radiated directly at them, and additionally, the heat would be collected and radiated by the moon itself. Put simply, the astronauts had no energy source that would have enabled them to reject the sun's intense heat. The moon has no atmosphere. It has a vacuum. Conduction and convection could not practically be used for cooling. The heat would have had to have been radiated away.
I know, Bob. I know.
They carried no energy source potent enough to re-radiate this heat away.
What powered the air conditioning?
What powered the air? Batteries. You had a number of big batteries in the lunar module.
Alan Bean's explanation of using batteries is not convincing. Efforts to explain successful functioning of the spacesuits amount to elaborate double talk.
Fantastic, sports fan.
After allegedly spending 3 days on the surface, the two astronauts blasted off, went up 69 miles, somehow docked with the command module traveling at a speed of over 4,000 miles per hour, and then they all flew back to Earth for a round trip of 480,000 miles. Doesn't this seem a bit beyond 1969 technology? How can this be explained as anything other than an accomplishment beyond belief? So what purpose would it serve to contrive such an elaborate hoax? Let's take a brief look at the events leading up to the American space race. After the Russians thoroughly spooked America in 1957 with the launching of Sputnik, citizens were in fear that the USSR would soon be able to drop an atomic bomb on the United States from orbit. What could be done to avert such a disaster? And to what lengths would the United States government go to ensure national security?
The Soviet Union has launched a second Earth satellite.
Gets the American people alarmed that a foreign country, especially an enemy country, can do this, and we fear this.
Man had his first great success in space when the Russians pushed a man across the threshold. He was Yuri Gagarin, the astronaut the Russians lionized as the first to orbit the Earth. It was the propaganda coup of the year.
Unbeknownst to the citizenry, high above the Earth, beginning at an altitude of 1,000 miles and extending an additional 25,000 miles, lay lethal bands of radiation called the Van Allen radiation belts. Every space mission in history with humans on board, from both the United States and Soviet Union, from the first in 1961 to the present, has been well below this deadly radiation field. Mercury, Gemini, Soyuz, Skylab, the Space Shuttle, all maintained altitudes well below 1,000 miles. All except Apollo. The more experienced Soviets spent 100 hours in space for every 20 hours of the US. In order to survive the hour-and-a-half journey through this radiation field necessary to reach the moon and return, solid lead shielding between the astronauts and the exposure outside would be required. The mammoth Saturn V rocket used by Apollo was already 35 stories tall and weighed as much as a battleship. To add additional tonnage in the form of a lead barrier completely surrounding the crew members would have made it impossible for the vehicle to get off the ground. That is why the Soviets, though more advanced, only sent an unmanned probe to the moon. The Apollo spacecraft's narrowest shielding was less than 1/8 of an inch of light aluminum. In 1998, the Space Shuttle flew to an altitude of 350 miles, one of its highest altitudes ever, hundreds of miles below the beginning of a field of radiation that was so severe that the astronauts inside of their shielded spacecraft and inside of their shielded spacesuits saw flashes of light with their eyes shut that they described as shooting stars, due to radiation penetrating first the shuttle's shielding, then their spacesuit shielding, then their skulls, and finally the retinas of their closed eyes. As a result, CNN issued the following report, noting NASA's unpredicted surprise. The radiation belt surrounding Earth may be more dangerous for spacewalking astronauts than previously believed. Scientists say the phenomena known as the Van Allen belts can spawn killer electrons when the Earth's magnetic field changes. These electrons that are being studied could have an important effect, not only on satellites, which has happened in the past, but could also affect the astronauts by creating large doses of radiation that could influence their health. The electrons can penetrate through various materials, including spacesuits, and can pass through, in fact, the walls of the space station, and can create high charges deep inside of these objects. President Kennedy, a man of political, not scientific background, set the irrevocable goal of landing a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s, just days after America's first astronaut had spent a mere 16 minutes in space, not even achieving a single orbit around the Earth.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
We take an additional risk by making it in full view of the world. But as shown by the feat of astronaut Shepard, this very risk enhances our stature when we are successful.
The technology necessary to launch the massive Saturn V rocket and an intercontinental ballistic missile is 95% similar. When the Soviet Union launched mankind's first satellite, Sputnik, in 1957, there was grave concern that they had mastered space ahead of the United States and might use this advantage to launch a first nuclear strike from an orbit high above North America. When they also put the first animal in space, then the first man in space, then achieved the first spacewalk, the first crew of 3, and the first ever of 2 simultaneously orbiting spacecrafts, concern turned to fear and then horror as America watched their communist enemy achieve all these firsts with no hope in sight of ever catching up.
President, a member of Congress said today that he was tired of seeing the United States second to Russia in the space field. I suppose he speaks for a lot of others. What is the prospect that we will catch up with Russia and perhaps surpass Russia in this field?
However tired anybody may be, and no one is more tired than I am, it is a fact that it's going to take some time, and I think we have to recognize it. They secured these large boosters, which have led to their being first in Sputnik and led to their first putting their man in space. We are, I hope, going to be able to carry out our efforts with due regard to the problem of the life of the man involved this year. But we are behind.
Location of an Apollo crew in the hundreds of thousands of miles surrounding the Earth and the Moon, it would be tantamount to trying to find a rowboat in the Atlantic Ocean. The fact that the Apollo program was so departmentalized, with various construction and test sites around the country, meant that only a few people saw the whole picture. And for the first time ever, there was no independent press coverage of such an historical event. Whatever pictures and sound were distributed to the public was strictly controlled and previewed by the federal government. They were then disseminated unchecked until this hour. For who would realize that the unthinkable was not only possible, but absolutely true? And what of the photographs? What do they tell us? On 3 separate occasions, our office asked NASA's Public Relations Department for every single picture of an astronaut on the surface of the Moon, just during the maiden voyage of Apollo 11. Many duplicates were sent. In all, fewer than 20 pictures were found, including first-hand investigation on site at the agency's vaulted archives. Quite surprising, considering the historical significance of the event. These very photographs are the same ones circulated year after year on anniversary commemorations. It is estimated that in just the first 60 minutes on the Moon, motivated by the tenuous nature of the circumstances, many more exposures could have been expediently taken. Also surprising is the scarcity of photographs of the mission's chief pioneer, Neil Armstrong. The greatest achievement in human history, and of the man whose first step echoed around the world, dawning a new age of scientific enlightenment, there is only one full-body picture of him on the Moon, besides this ghostly reflection. This one, taken by an automatic camera mounted on the side of the lunar module. Perhaps he feared liability should the whole conundrum later become unraveled. Perhaps he has forgotten that he attested to the authenticity of the event with his signature on this plaque engraved by the federal government. In fact, in the more than 30 years since the event, aside from NASA's initial press conference and the occasional brief anniversary remarks where few questions were permitted, from an analytical standpoint, photographic anomalies have to be sought out with an understanding of lighting and shadows. The most straightforward is simple. When objects are lit solely by the sun, as all the scenes on the moon were said to be, after all, lighting equipment was not only impractical, it was unnecessary in bright sunlight, then all shadows, regardless of the landscape, will run parallel with one another and never intersect, as shown by this example. In these seldom seen photographs, obtained from a rarely used auxiliary NASA archival site, it is clear that these scenes were lit with artificial light. These shadows, which are cast at different angles, are evidence that a second light source is being used. In addition, the sun would not cause an isolated hotspot like this, only an artificial light would. Again, intersecting shadows and another hotspot. And again. And again. It is simply impossible for this picture to have been taken with sunlight on the moon. Here, the shadows are shown to be as black as pitch. And yet here, completely in a shadow, the astronaut is lit up like a Christmas tree. How can this be? Or this, on the shadow side of the lunar module. In this magnification of an Apollo photograph, a rock, very likely a papier-mâché prop because of the crease here, is categorized with the letter C. In later releases of the same picture, the letter is gone, probably airbrushed out. Someone apparently forgot to create a burn crater underneath the lunar module's 10,000-pound thrust engine, despite the fact that during ground tests there was a real concern for the vehicle falling into the hole the engine created as it descended. Here is a Norman Rockwell depiction drawn just 2 years earlier based on the latest specifications and scientific data. In these enlargements, it looks as though the lunar module was simply placed there, not even one speck of moon dust on the landing pod. As a result, all subsequent flights had to have the same discrepancy, which was explained away by the effect of no atmosphere. And what about stars? On the moon, with no atmosphere, they must have been quite a sight to behold. Yet there is seldom any mention of them, if ever, by any of the astronauts on any of the missions. Undoubtedly, creating a mural with all the constellations properly placed in the sky would have been virtually impossible to create accurately, much less realistically. A competent amateur astronomer would have been able to call attention to the slightest error in measurement. The answer? Not to talk about the stars. Ever. In their post-flight press conference, it was the only question to which Neil Armstrong responded with an absence of memory.
When you looked up at the sky, could you actually see the stars and the solar corona in spite of the glare?
We were never able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the moon by eye without looking through the optics. I don't recall during the period of time that we were photographing the solar corona what stars we could see.
I don't remember seeing any.
Years later, though, Michael Collins would remember seeing the elusive stars and wrote about them in Expeditions to the Moon. It seems his memory improved the older he got. Why don't stars appear in any of the photographs? Simply because the proper, mostly closed exposure setting for the camera's iris, set that way to compensate for the bright sunlight on the moon's surface, completely diminished the faintness of relatively distant specks of diminutive light. This answer is true. It does not, however, explain why they never took any pictures of the stars by themselves, with an exposure setting perfect for them. While they took 3 automobiles to the moon, they never took a photographic telescope. Had they done so, they would have been able to see farther into the universe than had ever before been realized. If they had taken a telescope and were not actually on the moon, They would have had to concoct undiscovered galaxies that might one day prove to be non-existent. The cost of the 3 moon rovers in 21st century currency? Nearly $60 million each, though they had fewer parts than a Jeep. Where was all this money going? Then there's the flag, blowing in the wind, at least twice, on the atmosphereless moon. We can only guess that most of the missions were staged inside for fear of possible aerial or satellite reconnaissance from an unfriendly nation. The backpacks, designed for 1/6 gravity, must have had the cooling systems removed to allow for movement without falling over. With very near and hot studio lighting, that left one hot astronaut inside. Assuming that it was the astronauts inside, after all, their faces were always covered. The necessary mammoth amounts of air conditioning were probably responsible for the air current. Here the editor cuts to a still shot of the flag, just as the effect becomes noticeable. Here it is unchecked. This rare clip, attained decades ago, was never re-released with the inevitable increase in experience and scrutiny. To demonstrate 1/6 gravity, a bouncy, floaty feel to the astronauts' movements would be similarly achieved with relative simplicity. Slow motion. You are viewing the scenes as they aired more than 30 years ago. Now let's look at them with the speed doubled. It becomes discernible that they are, in fact, in Earth's gravity, and are no more leaving the ground than they would on Earth. It is clear from these rarely seen color television pictures that the crew of Apollo 11 brought a high-resolution color video camera with them on their mission, yet the only pictures broadcast live from the moon's surface were these from a low-definition black and white camera. In fact, the networks complained because in addition to this, they were forced to shoot the images, second generation, off of a projection TV of the technology of 30 years ago, and were not even allowed to take a direct feed, which further degraded the quality and clarity of the images. Perhaps this was precisely what NASA and the federal government had in mind. After all, it was a first, regardless of where they were. Better to open up their debut mission with fuzzy pictures and numerous blackouts, rather than show too much revealing detail of a false scene that was yet unproven.
I'm talking with Bill Casing, and Bill Casing is what you might call a pioneer in this whole issue of getting at truth and reality, and specifically in the area of the Apollo moon missions, what happened and what didn't happen. When the module set down on the surface of the moon, the amount of propulsion that would have been required to do that, and it leaves no cloud of dust, no crater.
Right. Having seen hundreds of rocket firings when I was employed by Rocketdyne, I know that the jet of the lunar module lander, the lunar lander, would have created an enormous crater. It would have scoured the moon's surface. It would have tossed up rocks, sand, everything, and created a crater maybe so large that the entire lunar lander could have sunk into it. After all, we're dealing with a 10,000-pound thrust engine, which is pointed directly at the surface, lowered into the surface, and yet if you look at pictures of the lunar lander on the moon, there is no disturbance whatsoever under the lunar lander's rocket.
And no dust deposited in the pads, the cup-shaped pads at the bottom.
That's another good point. Dust would have been blown 6 ways from Sunday and would have landed everywhere.
And then the famous scene, which has been played over and over, where they are landing there, but they're setting down, and you're hearing the astronaut talking through it.
Oh, that's a good point. I let's say, became aware of that only recently, that here's Neil Armstrong talking about landing on the moon with a microphone, and yet he's sitting practically on top of a rocket engine that is putting out sound levels of about 140 or 150 decibels. Now, we know that that is absolutely impossible to overcome that sound level inside the lunar lander with a normal human voice.
Eagle, we got you now. It's looking good, over. Roger, copy. Eagle, Houston, after yaw around angles, S-band pitch, -9er, yaw, +18. Roger, you're a go. You go to continue power descent. You're a go to continue power descent.
Altitude now 21,000 feet, still looking very good. Velocity down now to 1,200 feet per second.
You're looking great to us, Eagle. Give us a reading on the 1202 program alarm. Roger, we got you. We're going at alarm.
Good radar data. We're now in the approach phase, everything looking good. Altitude 4,200.
Houston, you're a go for landing, over. Roger, understand. Go for landing. 3,000 feet. Copy. Alarm.
Altitude 1,600. 1,400 feet, still looking very good.
700 feet, 21 down. 33 degrees. 100 feet, down at 19. 1201. 1201. Roger, 1201 alarm. We're go. Same type. We're go. Altitude, velocity, light. 8.5 down. 220 feet. 15 forward. 11 forward, coming down nicely. 200 feet. 4.5 down. 5.5 down. 60 seconds. Lights on. 6. Down 2.5. Forward. Forward. Good. 40 feet, down 2.5. Picking up some dust. 4 forward. 4 forward. Drifting to the right a little. Good. Okay. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Okay, we've changed our graphic picture here in the background, and it's a one-sheet poster that I put together from pictures on the website www.geocities.com/ApolloReality/. And the gentleman that put this together got actually these images off the Langley Research Center website. And some of these actually you're just seeing for the first time yourself, isn't that right, Bill?
That's right, yeah. I'm amazed to find these pictures. I've never seen any of them before except the one in the upper right. And what amazes me is this one here showing a model of the moon with a camera track, showing how easily it would have been to fake the filming of the moon.
And then the image just to the right of that shows like the finished moon.
Exactly.
With somebody sitting at the controls, maybe turning it or...
Right. These are very revealing pictures, and I strongly recommend people with PCs to download them and study them. And of course this brings up the subject of the death of whistleblowers. Men like Gus Grissom, who was burned to death along with Chafee and White.
He went pretty open with it, putting a lemon on
yeah, he was going to give an interview about what he really thought about Apollo. And as you say, he hung a lemon on the command capsule on the day that he was murdered. And we should also look at Scott Grissom, his son's evidence that a secret switch was installed in the capsule to ignite the fire that killed Grissom, Chafee, and White. We could go on for quite a while about the death and injury to people that have pursued this Apollo hoax subject very diligently.
They went to a NASA spokesman who was Brian Welch.
Oh yes,
and
right.
They asked him about some of these anomalies.
Right.
You recall what he had, what he said about some of the things they were asking him?
He tried to dispute everything that the Apollo hoax advocates brought out. But the interesting thing is that about a month after he gave this interview, he was dead.
That always kind of puzzled me because he was at least trying to hold on to it, right? So Do you think they would have actually killed him just because he didn't do a good enough job? Or?
Yes, I think that's what happened. He didn't do a good enough job. So they killed him as an example to other people who are defending, like Richard Hoagland. Hoagland obviously is a fake, and he's an employee of NASA who on many occasions has tried to discredit me and my associates.
Our next speaker is Professor James McKinney.
If you double the size of your rocket, you don't double the size of your payload. So you're very limited. And now let's try and get to the next planet or out to the moon. We have to start sending individual things up there, couple them together, and then go out to these other planets. By the way, there's a small problem with going to the moon, and inch by inch, NASA is leaking out that they know that there's a problem there. It's called the Van Allen belts, high radiation belts of charged particles around Earth, and we don't know how to get through them, they say. Well, isn't that interesting, because there sure didn't seem to be a problem back in 1969. Obviously, they didn't go to the moon. The United States did not go to the moon. The Russians knew it all along. I thought at the time we did, but I've since learned we absolutely did not. And there's no question about it. And they're starting to figure it out. NASA has a program called Living with a Star. That's a pretty name for how do we get through the Van Allen belts. They have all their top scientists working on it. It's a tremendous problem because we do not have any kind of a spacecraft that we can send up that doesn't have metal in it. And when these charged particles hit metal, they produce X-rays. Nothing you can do to get around that. So anybody sitting around something metal in outer space in the Van Allen belts is going to be French fried. And so that whole thing was a giant hoax. And you have second and third tier scientists in the United States who are running around saying, oh, yes, we did, yes, we did. But the very top level people, what I call the tier one scientists, the black op mill scientists, know for a fact we didn't go. And it's a real problem. They don't know how to get through there. This picture is with the new Hubble camera, and it shows that, in fact, if you take this angular distance out to Pluto and you translate it into the surface of the moon, we can, in fact, resolve the landing sites, the alleged lunar landing sites. And the way you would do this is you take the pictures at dusk when the shadows became very long, and it would be a very hard thing for them to fake. So at any rate, we have telescopes on Earth that are much larger than the Hubble. Much better resolving power. So why, you would think these astronomers would be chomping at the bit to show you those lunar landing sites. And look at the incredible resolving power of this telescope we have here. Why have none of them done that? Because there ain't nothing there. And we get all kinds of excuses. Oh, we can't turn the telescope up there because the moon's too bright. Well, then all of a sudden we saw the full moon on a web page, on a NASA web page, the entire full moon taken with the Hubble Space Telescope. And you're telling me they can't take one little teeny patch of the moon, which is millions of times less bright. So bottom line is, they know they didn't go.
Join us now on a quest for the truth to the moon. In this film, we shall not only prove beyond all reasonable doubt that many of the official NASA images of lunar exploration are fake, but we shall also examine the motives for the biggest lie put before the world. Why did NASA repeatedly fake lunar images and photographs? Why did NASA stage lunar expeditions which did not happen? The answer will surprise you. NASA spent gigantic sums of money during the 1960s, but most of it was spent on the ground, not in space. huge American corporations, many of which were manufacturing hardware for the military, made gigantic profits designing space vehicles and, more importantly, life-sized models of spaceships, and even huge stage sets resembling the lunar surface. Someone in NASA had realized that after taking billions of dollars from the American people, if they couldn't make it to the moon, they would fake it to the moon.
Obviously, if you're going to somewhere that nobody has been before, you need to have a simulator which recreates that environment as closely as you can. If you're going to the moon, you recreate the surface of the moon. And here we see a section of the lunar surface created. It's about 30 foot high, 30 foot long, 35 foot long. Scale is given by the two people standing in front of it. There were plenty of simulation exercises, but the point is, and this should be taken into account in virtually everything that is discussed with the Apollo program, 400,000 people may have worked on the program in total, but none of them had a need to know more than his own job required. The people who were making the rockets didn't know what the people who were making the spacesuits were doing, and because they had no need to know about that. Their job was to make the best models and the best simulation of the lunar surface that they could. And if we come up to this picture here, we see the three scales on which these models were built. We have here the whole moon as one unit. It stands about 20 foot high. We have here behind it a section of the surface of the moon. You'll notice it's curved. And here we have a more detailed section of the lunar surface.
What you're saying is that the images which we're told show a camera pointing out the window of the lunar module as it's coming into land on the moon could well have been filmed previously using these large-scale models.
That's right. It could well be that what we are looking at are films of realistic models. We have no means of knowing if they were actually taken on the lunar surface or whether what we're watching is part of the simulation exercise and the training exercise. And you'll notice here on these models there is a camera track. A camera starting at this end, coming down here, would approach the moon or appear to approach the moon and become ever closer towards it. This is a simulation rig that was built. This is the command and service module of the Apollo program. And you'll notice that the window here looks out onto a block here, and there's another one here. They're curved. These are the screens onto which the lunar surface was projected as the craft made a simulated approach towards the lunar surface.
Is what we're seeing a mixture of fact and fiction?
It is fact. It is fiction. It's mixed together. It's hard to separate them until you examine it closely. If a spacecraft is in deep space, the only possible explanation for a light seen through the window of the spacecraft is the sun. It's the only bright light in space. If it's not the sun, then it has to be some other artificial light, which implies that that particular image is possibly fiction.
July 1961. NASA was soon being criticized for the flimsy construction of their hardware. The first orbital capsules did not even have windows in them for the astronauts to look out of. One of the most vocal critics was one of NASA's most respected astronauts, an all-American hero named Virgil Gus Grissom, who almost drowned when recovery helicopters were unable to lift his space capsule from the sea. After a successful journey into space, Gus Grissom almost died through NASA's bad planning. Or was this an early attempt to silence Gus Grissom? May 1963. Astronaut Gordon Cooper experiences re-entry problems in his Faith 7 rocket ship. The prototype lunar module, known as the LIM, had serious stability problems. At this stage, there was no guarantee that even if NASA managed to get a spaceship orbiting the moon, they could land safely without killing the crew. Could the footage which we see of the LIM approaching the moon be filmed in a TV studio?
It was filmed in a TV studio. There's absolutely no doubts whatsoever about that. And the way that this film was created was by the use of models. There's nothing secret about the models. They exist. You can go and see them today. The models were very lifelike, very realistic. There is one that is a life-size model. It's in Flagstaff in Arizona. It's 2 miles long, and it's an exact replica of the Sea of Tranquility. The photographs were used to create from those images the replica of the Sea of Tranquility, so that if it was flown over in a helicopter, it would appear as if it was a spacecraft approaching a similar area to land. So yes, all the scenes of the lunar surface were filmed on Earth.
Radiation, and without having spacesuits nor spacecraft which can protect the occupants from radiation, NASA convinced the American people to pay $40 billion for the space program.
The most lethal forms of radiation, of course, are at the higher end of the spectrum. That's gamma rays and X-rays. We know what ultraviolet can do. If you stay out too long in the sun, you get sunburn and skin cancer and die, and it's all very sad. But gamma rays, and X-rays especially, are particularly lethal to humans, unprotected humans. There was no protection that I have been able to identify. I've found no reference to it. I found nothing that will tell me what level of protection is offered, so I have to assume none was. I've contacted the manufacturers of the spacesuits, and they said there was no radiation protection built into the spacesuits, because I asked them if these same spacesuits could be used by technicians to go to Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island, because the nuclear reactors produce the same radiation as produced in space. They said no, not advisable, no protection.
James Van Allen grew up in the small Iowa town of Mount Pleasant during the 1920s. He was an exceptional student, became class valedictorian, and exhibited an intense vision that even then looked beyond our planet.
The environment was the time of the Cold War, and it was something scary. It was something for a child that seemed very scary to have to hear about bomb shelters and hiding under our desks. And I remember first hearing that my father was going to go to Russia, and being so frightened by that, and asking my father, why was he going to Russia? Wasn't he scared? And I remember him explaining to me that in the scientific community, what they do, and as they take data and exchange data, somehow that transcends what is going on in the political arena. So that there is always a sense that the quest for intellectual activity was something very, remember that, so that the Cold War suddenly didn't seem very cold to me, even as a young child.
The media focused on the Explorer 1 achievement as at last legitimizing the U.S. as a worthy adversary to confront the communist Sputniks. The public seemed captivated with the propaganda created by this new space race. Dr. Van Allen and his students, however, chose to focus on the data that was returning from their scientific instrument inside Explorer 1.
When the first results came back, the group at the University of Iowa, this was Van Allen and Ernie Ray, then began to help with it, eventually Carl McElwain, saw immediately that there was an anomaly, there was something unexpected.
The difficulties one would encounter while trying to land a man on the moon and return safely to Earth are truly astounding. The moon has a harsh environment, with the surface temperature ranging from minus 170 degrees Fahrenheit in the shadows to 250 degrees Fahrenheit in the sunlight. It is also a vacuum. To think that men made it there and back a third of a century ago is quite a stretch. This should be apparent when one looks at how the space shuttle has fared going only 1/600th the distance that Apollo claims to have gone. After 3 men died in the capsule during the simulation in 1967, it was just 2 years later that men were walking around on the moon. This is less time than it took to launch the space shuttle again after its burn-up on re-entry in 2003. To win the X Prize, a private company had to fly a light craft to an altitude of 62 miles. This is just under the distance that the ascent module had to fly to reach the command module from the surface of the moon. Yet the winner of the X Prize on Earth had to have their vehicle hauled up by another vehicle and then fire its engines to get to the 62-mile mark. This should give you an idea of how difficult it is to just go 62 miles high, even with today's technology. Then, add to the fact that the ascent module, with its very low mass fraction, would have had to accelerate to over Mach 6 to dock with the command module, and the fictional nature of the event becomes self-evident. It is just outright unscientific and pathological to accept the moon landing claim given the total lack of confirmation and inability to duplicate anything that even slightly approaches the alleged events of 1969. Of course, by far the greatest mystery in all this is why the scientific community continues to fall for all this and accept it unquestioningly. Is science just another religion that has its sacred cows? If you want to stay in the club, must you defend the beloved cow, no matter how badly it stinks? Since nearly all of academia is dependent on funding from the federal government, any scientist brave enough to speak the truth would be committing career suicide. Scientists realize this, and therefore will not let their minds examine this objectively for even a moment. They all just prefer to run with the herd. As victims of cognitive dissonance, so-called scientists argue in support of the moon landings out of reflex. If one examines a timeline of aviation and space travel milestones, this contradiction of logic becomes apparent. Consider Kitty Hawk in 1903, Lindbergh crossing the Atlantic in 1927, Sputnik in 1957, through the space shuttle in the latter part of the 20th century. These were all within 400 miles of Earth, yet the alleged moon landings of the late 60s purportedly took astronauts 240,000 miles away from the Earth. The Apollo missions, therefore, stick out as a fantastic statistical anomaly, and without any other similar events to confirm or duplicate the hypothesized event, 1/3 of a century since, the scientific method requires that they be discarded. This being the case, no one that believes the moon landing claim should be allowed to call themselves a scientist. The Cold War provided the perfect motivation for the deception. Under the specter of a nuclear threat from the Soviets, and in the shadow of the Bay of Pigs invasion, it is easy to imagine those involved believing that it was their patriotic duty to help bluff the Soviets into thinking we had military superiority. It apparently worked. A nuclear war was never fought, so we are certainly in no position to second-guess the military strategy that the government employed. With the space race officially ending with this achievement, Nixon was quick to seize the spotlight by becoming the first U.S. president to visit Moscow. Cooperation for joint space missions quickly became the topic of discussion between the leaders, ushering in détente, an easing of tensions between the two superpowers.
As you're probably well aware, we are still working on other programs, Skylab being the prime effort starting in the spring of next year. We're also working on the cooperative mission with the Russians, which will take place in 1975. And of course, we've got quite a few of the flight control team as well as other center elements involved in the work on the shuttle. So it's the start of a new era, I hope.
It is easy to see why the government would want to perpetuate such a myth, even after the military objectives were achieved. The alleged accomplishment is a source of national pride, and no one wants to be the one to remove this source of pride. It would also not come as a surprise to find out that in upper levels of certain agencies, the moon landing hoax is actually somewhat of an inside joke, in that within these institutions, those that have attained a certain level are entrusted with this secret information. Considering the difficulties attendant in such a trip, one thing is for sure. When the first person actually arrives on the moon someday, they will have bought themselves a one-way ticket. An exploratory voyage of this magnitude does not lend itself so easily to a return.
Hey, how are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between three buildings?